how this came about. So 2 weeks ago, we had a board meeting, and since we cannot meet at the university at all, we decided to try Zoom because one of the board members had a Zoom account, and it turned out to be a really excellent way to conduct our board meetings. And at that board meeting, we talked about why not have the general meeting using Zoom. So this is how it came about. Well, we needed somebody to be able to speak at this meeting. And I asked the 3 students that had been scheduled to talk if they were willing to do so. And all 3 of them were eager to take part. And I know they have practiced. So tonight we have the special presentation, or the treat of hearing 3 students from Acadia talk about their research. The students are Riley Scanlan, who is on the board, and Riley received the BNS award last year, the $2,000 award that she put towards her research. And I should mention that the BNS award that really hasn't had a name in the past, we've decided after talking to Glennis Gibson, if it would be okay to call it the Merritt Gibson Natural History and Environmental Award. So this award that we give out is from now on going to be called the Merritt Gibson Natural History and Environmental Award. The other students is Sam Stegen, who is from environmental science, and the 3rd students will be Carter Feltham, who is a biology student. So we'll start with Riley, talking about her research into old growth. So the title is Preserving Our Ecological Ancestors, Mapping Remaining Old Growth Forests in the Annapolis Valley to Guide Conservation Efforts. Riley, are you there?
Yes, hello.
Perfect, excellent, thanks. Take it away.
Okay, yes, so I'll share with you what I have.
There.
Okay, yes, thank you, Soren. My name is Riley, and yeah, I'm excited to present to you this work that your society has helped fund. So thank you all for that, and I hope you'll enjoy the research that I conducted. Feel free to stop me at any point if you have any questions, or if you can't hear me.
Riley, I think we'll leave the questions to the end, like
okay. Sorry.
After the presentation.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, old growth forests are often referred to as ecological ancestors or as living museums of ecological history, and that's because they tend to take a very long time to develop, but contain a lot of really important information. And this research essentially wanted to look for these ecosystems within the Annapolis Valley. So prior to European colonization, the Acadian forest region that we find ourselves in would have made up approximately 50% old growth stands. But today, studies estimate that it's less than 1% of remaining forests actually contain old growth. And so we wanted to look into whether we could find any remaining stands and try and map out where they are. So a few questions that guided my research. Let's see. There we go. Okay, so first we wanted to know whether there are any remaining old growth stands in our little area. And then we wanted to know where they are. So that's where that map comes in, if we could determine their extent and their exact location. And then finally, I wanted to at least ask and attempt to answer the question of why they might occur where they do. If there's anything in our history of forest management, or if there are any patterns in the stands that do remain that can help shed some light on why they occur in certain places and not others, and whether we could use that information to better protect them going forward. But of course, before we attempt to protect something, we have to understand what it is. So as people tend to associate them with, old growth stands are dominated by large old trees. Over time, these trees grow to become very large and canopy dominant. But eventually they do die, either from wind, storms, or tree senescence. And dead trees are actually really important for the continuation of old growth. So when a tree falls in a forest, that sunlight it was previously taking up in the canopy is now able to reach the forest floor, where we have young trees and shrubs eagerly waiting to take up that new sunlight. And eventually they'll compete, and one or a few of them will become canopy dominant. So we see the structure of small and young trees living next to really old trees. That's known as the mosaic structure that you see in old growth forests and is indeed really important. And over time, that will allow natural selection to favor those species that are able to withstand that shady understory. So the Acadian forest region that we have here in Nova Scotia has old growth stands generally dominated by eastern hemlocks and red spruces that can survive that shady understory and compete to become eventually canopy dominant. But again, we only typically have few small disturbances within a forest from wind or insects or storms. So the canopy tends to generally be very dense and not a lot of sunlight penetrating. And all of these features that we tend to use to describe and define old growth forests are also what make it so important. So over time, when these forests develop a really complex genetic diversity that we're still getting information about. They're also home to a great variety of different species. Dead trees are known as homes for cavity nesters and borers, and some rare lichen have been found to survive only in old growth stands. They're also important for the maintenance of riparian ecosystems. So fallen trees can help aerate waterways, or leaves and branches that fall into streams and rivers will provide nutrients to those ecosystems. And also they play a role in the global water cycle by filtering water globally and by sequestering carbon from our atmosphere. So it's actually been found that old trees can sequester more carbon than younger, faster growing trees. And given our current fight against climate change, I think all of these, but especially the latter, will be really important in understanding them and also preserving these ecosystems for these ecosystem services. So in order to go about preserving these habitats, we need to first know where they are. And in order to do that, I first created a GIS layer that we use to predict that certain stands have a greater likelihood of containing old growth forests. So we first started by doing a satellite imagery analysis. So essentially you can use Google satellite imagery, and based on the forest density, so the spacing between trees and the crown sizes, you can determine tree species and how likely that stand is to be old growth. And that coupled with QGIS querying, where you can essentially select for certain polygons in a map that have a higher likelihood to be old growth. So essentially they haven't been disturbed or developed within our known history. And then using that map, we conducted field assessments. So following the Old Forest Policy Score Sheet laid out by the Department of Lands and Forestry, we're able to determine exactly which stands were and are not old growth. And the way that assessment works is it assigns a score to each stand out of 100 based on these attributes. So we'll determine the average tree age for that stand, how far apart the trees are and the estimated tree density, how much deadwood there is, what species are there, how much sunlight is getting through the canopy, and whether humans have disturbed that area. And that generally covers those main characteristics that I described that you need to have for an old growth stand to occur. But then it also delineates which stands are more likely to be old growth on a class system. So class 1 being the best possible old growth, up to class 4, which is generally either becoming or is slightly old growth. It's kind of on a spectrum. And so we considered class 1 and 2 stands as being true old growth. That's a tree core taken out near North Alton that was used to determine tree age. And then finally, I conducted a literature review to answer that question of why some stands might be old growth and why some others are not, which generally looked at the history of forest management to try and answer that. And so this was the map that I eventually came up with. And these little red dots are class 1 and 2 old growth stands. So we found that about 27% of all of our site assessments were in class 1 or 2 old growth stands. Given that less than 1% of forests remaining in Nova Scotia are expected to be old growth. We're quite happy with that result. And I can actually show you how this map works. It's kind of the neat thing now that we're all online together. Let's see if this will work. So here's my map. You can see that. I don't know if you're able to give me a thumbs up. Pat, I can see you. Can you give me a thumbs up? Okay, cool. So right here is Wolfville, and the idea is that anyone with this map could go conduct a site assessment if they're qualified to do so, and then could determine if these polygons are old growth. So here we did a lot of site assessments along the Gaspereau River, and here's a little waypoint taken at each site. So these are all class 1 and 2 old growth stands. If you've been to the trail along there, you can see along the slopes of the river some nice hemlock old growth forests. So let's go back. That's kind of a neat thing. Let's just see how it works. And so answering again that last question of why these stands occur where they do, and if there's any patterns in where they occur, I first asked whether there's anything common among these stands. So a lot of them were in softwood forests dominated by eastern hemlocks, and a lot of them were found near waterways. So you can see here along the North Mountain, these lines of pink polygons are all highlighted stands along rivers intersecting the mountain. And then finally, the majority of stands are found and highlighted along the North and South Mountains, and very little along the valley floor, which you'd expect given the high level of development and agriculture along the valley floor. But that doesn't necessarily explain why they still occur on the slopes. And so, after my search through the history of forest management, I was able to at least somewhat answer that question. So when Europeans first came to Nova Scotia, they cleared vast tracts of forest for agriculture and construction, and eventually to supply wood product industries. So that's lumber, pulp and paper, and the bioenergy sectors. And when they cut those trees down, they replanted them with earlier succession, faster growing trees because that seemed more economically viable. But of course that undervalued our remaining old growth stands. And so the only ones that really do remain are almost inadvertently protected. So there's a waterway buffer zone that prohibits forestry within 20 meters, I believe, of a waterway. And so that's why we see stands highlighted along the rivers intersecting the mountain. And then also we see the majority of the stands along the slopes of the North and South Mountains because it was simply too hard to access for logging and forestry endeavors. It's difficult to cut down trees on steep slopes. So they're almost accidentally protected, but that shows that they can occur here because they do. And so I think going forward, what we need to do is question how we see our forests and reevaluate how we place value in them. And that's not impossible. I looked at a few case studies in my research of places that have done this. So in Costa Rica and Germany, they were able to restructure their forest management to be protective of forests. So Costa Rica is now basing their economy on tourism that encourages the growth of healthy forests. And so questioning how we place our value in forests could perhaps better protect old growth stands going forward. And so I hope that this research can help provide those areas in need of conservation here in the valley and highlight exactly which stands are indeed old growth. And I hope that going forward, it can be continued for at least the rest of the province, or in theory, the rest of the country. I was working in the herbarium in the Casey Irving Center last summer, and they're planning to continue both the predictive GIS layer for the rest of the province in highlighting stands that might be old growth, but also in continuing site assessments to try and determine exactly what extent of old growth still remains here in the valley. And so I think, again, by doing that, we would be providing more information for conservation efforts. And finally, which is kind of the interesting part, is hopefully we can reevaluate how we view the ecosystem services provided by the old growth stands. So one example of ways that we can value those ecosystem services is through economic incentives. The federal Ecological Gifts program, I believe it's called, allows people to set aside ecologically important land and they'll receive a tax credit. And so by providing that economic incentive, private landowners are more likely to protect old growth forests. And given that in the Annapolis Valley, I think it's about 70% of all forest land is privately owned, we need to question how we create these protection policies, whether it's applying to only government land or also to private land. And I think economic incentives are a really great way to get private landowners on board. So yeah, thank you all for listening, and let me know if you have any questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
If everybody was unmuted, you would hear an applause right now taking place. So, excellent. Thank you. Now, are there questions from anybody?
Here. I have a question.
Yep.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Can you hear me? In terms of how old, in terms of human years, are the old growth forests? What is the range in Nova Scotia or in this region?
I think technically the minimum average age is 125 for a stand to be considered true old growth. Right. Mm-hmm. But again, a stand could be 125, the average age, but not have all of the other features of an old growth forest, and it might not be considered old growth. Though, I guess to answer, the minimum age to be old growth is about 125.
Thank you. That was interesting.
Good. Anybody else with questions? I don't see any raised.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question.
Yes, yes, Howard.
Howard here. You showed a core that from which you got the age of the tree, but presumably you didn't core dozens of trees. So how did you determine the age of individual trees?
Yeah, so the actual score sheet laid out by the government says that you should use a prism to determine which trees are counted in your plot, and then we didn't have a prism. So essentially we looked at the 10 nearest canopy dominant trees in our plot, and of those 10, looked at the 3 largest and scored the smallest of the 3 largest. So essentially you want it to have 66% of the trees smaller in diameter than our tree and 33% larger, and that's considered the average tree in each stand. If that answers your question or makes sense. Okay.
Riley, I'm familiar with the term ecosystem services, but I wonder if you could help us understand what you mean by ecosystem services, partly because I'm interested in understanding whether you're coming from truly an ecological perspective or from an economic perspective.
Yeah, I wanted to delve into that a bit in my thesis also, because it's an interesting topic, but you can only talk about so much. And I think there can either be a more anthropogenic view, which tries to place a dollar value on what we're getting from an ecosystem, but then there's also a more perhaps holistic view that tries to determine what an ecosystem is providing to our planet. So I think in my thesis, I take a bit of an anthropogenic view, solely because it trying to align still with sustainable forestry, not just ecological conservation, because I understand that we still need to have an economy, but perhaps that they can work in tandem with our old growth stands remaining intact.
And what would that include?
Sustainable forestry?
No, what would ecosystem services include within a sustainable forestry context? Right,
so that's, somehow trying to place value and protection around those various attributes that I explained, I guess. So its contribution to carbon sequestration and in the hydrologic cycle and maintaining biodiversity. So somehow preserving those within a healthy forest.
Thank you.
Okay, the next speaker is Sam's, I hope you're speaking. I think I'm hopefully pronouncing your name correctly. And Sam is in environmental science, an honor student there. And the title of her talk is Managing Virus Infections of Raspberry Crops in Annapolis Valley, Nova Scotia. Take it away, Sam.
Thank you, Soren, for the introduction. And yes, that's my last name is Stegan.
Stegan, okay.
You got it right. And I'd like to thank Riley Scanlan as well for inviting me to this meeting. And thank you, Soren, for setting this up as well. Patrick. Okay. Please just interrupt me if you can't hear me. My name is Sam. I'm from the Department of Earth and Environmental Science, and I'm going to talk about how we can reduce our virus load in conventional raspberry crops. So to give you all a little bit of background information, the Annapolis Valley is known for its abundant agricultural growth due to its mild microclimate, skilled farmers, and fertile soils. Berries and fresh fruit exportations bring in roughly $21 million annually to the province of Nova Scotia. And red raspberries are common hosts for the large raspberry aphid, Amphora aganthonica. And research on this species plays an important role in Nova Scotia, especially in the agricultural community, because of its impact on crop reduction. So the large raspberry aphid, Amphora aganthonica, is a known vector of rubus yellownet virus and raspberry leaf mottle virus, which are two common viruses in the Annapolis Valley, Nova Scotia. And once infected, a plant will carry this disease for its entire lifespan. And it can cause even up to a 50 to 70% reduction in fruit yield, depending on the intensity of the virus. The main cause of these viruses being passed from plants is through aphids. Because they're highly mobile creatures, they're extra effective at passing viral pathogens. A few signs of virus presence could be that your plant has delayed growth or is smaller in size, or even has chlorotic foliage, which is a visible yellowing discolor from the lack of chlorophyll in the plant tissue. And then I found the life cycle of the aphid extra fascinating. The large raspberry aphid has what we call incomplete metamorphosis. So they go through 3 distinct life stages: an egg, a nymph, and an adult. They go through both sexual and asexual life stages, which makes them our selective species, and that means that they can reproduce very, very quickly. They can even give birth to live young, which is fascinating. So the stem mother can give birth to a daughter who is impregnated already with another daughter, and so she'll birth 2 generations at once, which makes them even more able to build up in really big population sizes. The large raspberry aphid is also monoecious, so it is not known to seasonally alter through hosts. That's specific to the large raspberry aphid. And then to the left here, my diagram, you can see in the fall we have the emergence of males, and that's when we'll see sexual reproduction happening for the first time. And then the female will then lay her eggs at the base of a raspberry cane for overwintering and extra protection. And in the spring, those eggs finally hatch. They're called first generation nymphs, and those nymphs will produce clones that are genetically identical. And then eventually those clones morph into adults, where they'll develop wings and they'll start migrating. And that's when we see that problem with viral pathogens being passed around. So my research questions sought to answer: within a conventional field, where is the virus most prevalent? And is it most prevalent in wild growing blackberries or wild growing raspberries, or in conventional fields? How is that virus being transmitted, and where is it coming from? And how can these growers better manage their virus presence in the future? So there are 2 important concepts that make aphids problematic in conventional agriculture. First, the aphid must vector the virus. So that means they have to be feeding on plant tissue that's infected for a prolonged period of time, which can be in between 2 minutes to several hours, depending on the virus. And then the aphid has to move. So with the development of wings and migration, when the environmental conditions are favorable or the colony size becomes densely populated. And quickly, I'll go over the virus steps of transmission. And so the large raspberry aphid has a piercing mouth part that sticks into the leaf tissue and uptakes the virus. Through the stylet, it passes through the food canal, in through the midgut and the hindgut, and eventually passes back through to the salivary gland. And when the aphid is feeding on a non-infected plant, it can actually pass that virus and infect that plant that way. So in my research, I did 2 field collection methods to track the abundance of the large raspberry aphid at 3 different sites. I used yellow pan trapping and I used visual observation. So I was working with a team of integrated pest management consultants, and visual sampling is a common practice for integrated pest management. And we wanted to compare whether trapping would be more effective at trapping large raspberry aphid. And we also tested 30 leaf samples for virus presence and absence. Those samples were sent along to a lab in BC with in collaboration with Perennia and Kentville Research Station. So what I found was that the pan trapping was more effective, meaning that it caught more large raspberry aphid than we found using visual sampling and using a 10x field lens. The edges of a conventional field actually collected more of the large raspberry aphid than the middle of the conventional field. And what I found through previous literature was that this could mean that there's a greater risk of infection along the edges of a conventional field if we're seeing a greater number of aphids there. And the virus results demonstrate that there was a greater presence of virus in wild sites than in conventional sites. And that led to the question, are these wild sites that are near conventional sites actually reservoirs for virus and enhancing that virus transmission when the aphid is migrating into a conventional from a wild site? So this is something that some other literature talked about called the edge effect. And while this was talked about in other research, it wasn't, it was hard to find research that really, that this stood out with. And so I thought that my research kind of highlighted that a little bit. And I think it's important to talk about. So I called the edge effect as an area exposed to a wild site or to a prevailing wind. And here is a clip of my site map, just from one of the 3 sites. And the E's on the site map are where I visually sampled for the aphid. And that's along the edge of the conventional site there. And the yellow pan traps are represented by the yellow squares. So I was tracking the abundance of the raspberry aphid from the middle of the field and the edge and the wild sites. And what I found was that the abundance of the large raspberry aphid in the wild treatments at site 3, this site to the left, it actually went down in half, while the abundance of the large raspberry aphid in the edges of that conventional field at the same site in the same week increased 4.5 times. So while this is just one small example, it is a possible theory that the edges of a conventional field are more vulnerable to aphid migration and virus transmission. Here is the abundance during August that I had from the large raspberry aphids, and that blue arrow there is showing where the numbers spiked. So the dotted blue line is site 3 wild, where we had 4 aphids and then it dropped down to 2. And in the same week, the conventional field at the same site went from 2 aphids to 9. So while those sample sizes are small, they're actually larger than most literature I found, where the sample size was less than 1. So that was interesting as well, that it may seem like not a lot, but we were finding more than others had found. In the end, I thought that there was a few ways that growers could potentially control their virus loads in the future. One would be managing the wild sites that may be acting as reservoirs and enhancing that edge effect. You could do this by removing the wild raspberries that are located near the conventional crops. And I also think integrated pest management is an important tool for modern agriculture since it uses a threshold base value for applying controls on insects, which it conserves our energy, I think, as we move to a more modern agricultural practice. And I'd like to thank Kirk Hillier, who is my supervisor at Acadia, and Erica Bent, who owns and operates agricultural pest management, agricultural pest monitoring consulting in Wolfville, Nova Scotia. Are there any questions?
Excellent. Thank you so much. And again, if you could hear everybody, they would be applauding madly. So maybe stop your presentation, because then we can see people.
Okay.
And are there any questions? Again, if you would like to do that, you can go to participants list and click the little hand. Yeah.
I'm curious as to whether, based on your initial question, whether both raspberries and blackberries are equal sources of the virus.
Yeah, that was really interesting. We did find that virus was present in blackberries as well as the wild raspberries, but we didn't sample any conventional blackberries, only because we found the wild growing blackberries later in the summer. So we were able to take virus samples from there, which was significant in showing that the large raspberry aphid actually is a host to blackberries as well as raspberries. So that was interesting, and I think if we did this research again, we would have definitely included both raspberries and blackberries in our sampling.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah, Howard?
You gave an example in one of your photographs of what I would call, in all ignorance, a ladybug or a ladybird. Are they something to encourage, to discourage the virus?
Ladybugs are predators of aphids.
Yeah.
Naturally, but I don't know if there's any significant research going on that says ladybugs would lower virus loads, if that answers your question. All I know is that they are predators, but
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. I have a question. In the last slide, you mentioned pest management. In the current usage, are there pesticides being used? Are some better than others? Mm-hmm.
yeah, pesticides are definitely being used in conventional agriculture to control aphid populations. I don't know which ones would be better or not.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
are they useful? I mean, do they work?
yes, absolutely. In my experience, when I've worked with integrated pest management, I've done that for 3 summers, and farmers do use pesticides to control aphid populations, and they work successfully. But I don't know which pesticides are being applied and what they contain in them.
Right. So are organic fields affected in the same way? And how are they managed?
Yeah, they are impacted the same way, and there's currently nothing you can do to cure a virus that's already there. So if a field is infected, say an organic field's already infected, unless they replant it, those plants are always going to have that virus.
With the virus on the plant, does it come early in the spring, or do you see it more so in the summer? And what does it look like? Is it attacking the cane, or is it the leaf, the flower, or the fruit?
Okay, that's a really good question. I didn't get to dive into that as much detail as I'd like to. I do know that it affects the leaf and the berry for sure, because if the plant is infected, the berries won't grow as nicely or as big, and studies have shown that there's reduction in plant size, so I can only assume that berries would be infected. but what you do notice is a yellowing discolor in the leaves, and it's called chlorotic foliage. So it looks like a green leaf with yellow spots, and I think that's more distinctive of the rubus yellow net virus. So if you wanted to Google that, it would come up with a couple pictures if you're planting some raspberries at home.
Mhm. Thank you.
We have a problem with aphids and mother plants, and we also have raspberries. And one of our problems is we're in sandy soils where we have a lot of ants. And ants seem to encourage aphids. And I wonder if you found that was true of the raspberry aphid.
Yeah, ants and aphids are really neat. They live in symbiosis. And there's a few examples that I looked at with a potato aphid and ants, where in fact, potato aphid will actually protect the eggs of the aphids, or sorry, the ants will protect the eggs of the aphids so that when the aphids migrate, they bring something back to the habitat that improves the life of the ants. So you'll often see ants and aphids living in symbiosis together.
Okay, well, let's move on to the last speaker of the evening, and that is Carter Feltham. Carter, are you ready?
All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Carter Feltham, and I'm going to talk a little bit about more of my personal experiences and observations I've made throughout my work with turtles in Nova Scotia. I've been working with turtles quite a bit longer than just my master's thesis. I wish I had more results to show for my master's thesis, but since the coronavirus, I've been shut out of the lab and I cannot continue for now. I can do a little bit on some of my other work for now, but it's a little bit of a pain not being able to work on my project. First, I want to touch on some of the species in Nova Scotia. So in Nova Scotia, we have 4 species of turtles. The Blanding's turtle on the top left here is the one I'm researching for my master's. It can be distinguished from other turtles by its bright yellow throat and neck. They also have yellow flecks on their shell, but you can really only see them when they're wet. Another species at risk in Nova Scotia is the wood turtle. They have the bright orange shoulders and neck, and their shell is a lot more textured than the Blanding's turtle. And then we have 2 of the more common species, the painted turtle on the bottom left. They're quite a range in size, from quite small to almost the size of a small Blanding's turtle. And then everybody's favorite, the snapping turtle, which is the largest in Nova Scotia and is now listed as special concern, I believe. A bit about me. I started volunteering with Blanding's turtles nesting in 2001-ish area. So I was about 7 years old, and you can see me in the giant yellow raincoat down to my knees. I started working with the Mersey Tobiotic Research Institute, or MTRI, in 2014 with various projects, but mainly working with turtles and snakes. So I'd like to think I have quite a bit of experience working with not only species at risk and reptiles in Nova Scotia. Beyond that, I have been trained to handle them properly, and MTRI has special permits that allows me to hold them and do special processes with them. Anyway, we do minimize the amount of time we handle them because we don't want to disturb their day-to-day or stress them out. And we highly encourage people to not pick them up unless they're in danger, like if you see them in the road, which if you can do in a safe manner to yourself, move them off to the side of the road and just do it quickly as possible. All right. So a little bit about my master's project. A recently discovered group of Blanding's turtle was actually found based on a public observation, which was wonderful news. We've discovered over 65 new individuals in this area, which is great because the original estimation was less than 350 adult landing turtles in Nova Scotia. My supervisor, Steve Mockford, he did a genetic analysis to compare the 3 known populations of Keji, Makujik, McGowan Lake, and Pleasant River. And he found that despite their proximity, they're actually distinct populations. This is great information for creating a management plan. And so we consider each one separately and focus efforts and money into each one rather than focusing on just one and using the information as a proxy for all of them. For my master's degree, I am doing a genetic analysis of this new group, which is located somewhere down here. And I'm trying to see where they fit into this whole scheme of things. This group is in a very different style of working landscape. And relative to the other groups, they're quite far and isolated. So to the nearest population, it's about 25 kilometers straight shot. But between Keji and Pleasant River, those 2 further ones indicated by the blue and orange dots, it's less than 25 kilometers, and there's McGowan in between, so there's sort of a stopping point, which makes moving between them a little more possible. The hatchling landing turtle, you can see here, is only about the size of a toonie. So at this stage, they're extremely vulnerable to predators, and the recent introduction of chain pickerel is definitely a threat to their survival. I think it was Blue Nose Coastal Action Foundation found a chain pickerel with 3 hatchling snapping turtles in its stomach. So this is definitely a huge threat that's coming up on our list. The adult turtles are a little bit bigger, and they are usually compared to an army helmet in size and shape. They have quite a high domed shell, and they're relatively smooth and about medium-sized turtle. Blanding's turtles can live up to and possibly beyond 80 years old, and they are one of the longest living freshwater turtles in the world. They don't mature until they're about 20 years old, and they only lay about, on average, 5 to 10 eggs a year. So that not only are they late maturing, they have low fecundity, and they have low recruitment rates. So all of these things have put them at great risk for environmental changes. We continually monitor the populations using a few different techniques. Visual surveys are by far the most common. You go and you just look for them. It's the easiest way to do it. We often use tracking of individuals as a way to monitor how individuals move and use the landscape. And if we're lucky, they'll actually lead us to other turtles. And trapping we only do in the summer months when the turtles are active. The tracking here, you can see you have to have the turtle in your hand to do it. You attach a little radio, you can see on the back there. We actually did a little bit of GPS tracking as well with some of the females, which was amazing information to get back. Although the one I did get the information, she just traveled up and down the river a few times. Once you have the tracker on them, you can use either the multi-directional antenna that you plop on top of your car and you drive up and down the road, or the unidirectional antenna you can see there in the canoe to pinpoint where they are. So here's an image of some of the live traps we use. We set them up usually on the beginning of the week. We check them every day, and then we pick them up at the end of the week. Everything we catch in them every day is recorded in a notebook and then released. I always love trapping because there's that sort of, what are we going to get today idea. And when we set these, we always set them so that they're secure. There's nothing going to drag them off. They have to have at least a foot of airspace. And we always check the weather for rain so that we don't end up going out in a thunderstorm and no turtles end up getting soaked and the water doesn't flood out the traps. Sometimes we do get some pretty large snapping turtles. This will play. This is always interesting and sometimes difficult to manage, but the back of the trap has a large mouth on it that we can open up, and then we just turn the trap around and let the snapping turtle walk out on its own. No one's ever going to stick their hand in a trap with one of those. I mean, snapping turtles are pretty moody when they get stuck in a small space, and you don't want to test out their jaw strength. Here in this trap, there's actually 3 snapping turtles. One there on the bottom right with its nostrils sticking up. There's one squished over to the left there. And then a third one we actually didn't know was in there until we tried to pick up the trap and literally could not pick it up. Underneath, you can almost see the tail sticking out to the left of the 3 there. I'll actually show you the video so you can get a glimpse of him in a second. Here on the right is a young snapping turtle. So I do recommend that you never pick them up because they have jaws and they have claws and they will scratch and bite if they get a chance. But if you do have to pick one up for whatever reason to get them out of the road, keep your fingers and hands as far back as you can. If you can keep them behind the back legs, you're probably going to do better and keep away from those snapping jaws. So you can see here, of course, this is a small one. It's a little easier to hold them with one hand underneath, but that's your best bet. Snapping turtles are usually sitting at the bottom of lakes and rivers, waiting for prey to come nearby into their mouths. And their eyes are more designed for sitting at the bottom of a lake where it's dark, and we have really murky water here. Now, if you're a turtle that quite literally cannot retract into its shell, or the fact doesn't really have much of a shell, and you're out of the water and something big and massive is coming at you, you're going to act pretty defensive towards it. I've had a lot of interactions with snapping turtles and a lot of situations where they're not comfortable, like stuck in a trap, but I've never been bitten by one, and that's just a whole matter of being careful of them and respecting them. I've seen snapping turtles in the wild actually come up and swim up to me and just kind of see what I was doing because they were curious. And I've seen a couple being a little goofy as well, so it's all situational, and if they're comfortable, they're way less intimidating. So you can see that massive snapping turtle there who's actually green from all the algae growing on him. He took up the entire bottom of the trap. And then the poor little guy just kind of flopping out at the end. He did not want to be in there with those other 2. So quickly, just wanted to go over how we age the turtles or get an estimate. So every year that the turtle is growing through the summer, and in the winter they cease growth because it's cold and they kind of go into a torpor. So just like trees, they lay down rings, and you can count those rings up until about maturation when they stop growing. Then after so long of walking over ground and gravel and swimming and stuff, their shell actually gets worn down and they lose those rings. So after that, it becomes a guessing game of how old they are. Typically between 20 and 30, they keep a few rings, especially in the concavities of their shell, but this one on the far right, you can tell is an old girl that's been around for a while. Some suitable habitat for turtles, they seem to prefer narrow, deep brooks, and all reptiles look for a few key factors, such as temperature gradients, vegetation, areas to sun themselves, and opportunities to forage. Here's a couple of examples. Shallow pools with lots of sphagnum and grass. They typically love brooks with overhanging sweet gale and leatherleaf that they can hide in and stay away from predators, or hide from researchers that are trying to find them. And then bottom left here is a pool that's more than my height deep. And there was 4 turtles in there, and I stared for half an hour, never got another glimpse of them. And they had an exit brook, so they probably took off. Coves are also sometimes used by the turtles, mainly adults, because there's a few too many predators for the young ones. And they also seem to really like areas with all this bladderwort in the water. You can see it, and the overhanging veg again. A few other species that we find using the same habitat, lots of monarchs, other butterflies. I've seen hundreds of common cabbage whites and sulfurs. 2018, we found more than a dozen monarch caterpillars that we recorded. Also, eastern ribbon snakes seem to go hand in hand with Blanding's turtle habitat, which is great because you can kind of do 2 birds with 1 stone there with doing research. Always lots of frogs, always hearing the banjo frogs. I also got to see a couple wood frogs. I absolutely love how well he camouflages in with the leaf litter. And a couple mentionable birds. Always see common bitterns, and I always hear them in the swamps. There's a red-winged blackbird who dive bombs me every single year. And then last year, I got to see my first bobolink. And a few other ones over the last 3 summers that we spent in that new population. We've seen chimney swifts, and we've seen all-sided flycatcher every year. Last year, we happened to notice that not only 2 adult chimney swifts, but 3 fledgling chimney swifts as well. And I got dive bombed some more by the adults. So I think we got a little too close to their nest. I went back later, and I believe that the tree on the left there might have been their natural nesting site, and I've never seen a natural nest site before, so I thought that was truly cool. And then the picture on the right, we stopped one day when we heard the olive-sided flycatcher, and we saw him and the female as well. And I got a little bit of film of him, and I sent it to the right person, and the next day they were out there recording all the information for him.
Good. Thank you again. And again, lots of applause. So now, are there any questions? Well, you're fascinated with turtles, obviously, if you've done this since 1980. No, not 1981, 2001, you said.
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. I think I really think that citizen science approach they've taken down in Keji is phenomenal, because it does mean that I've had other students that had started down there, like at quite an early age, to take part in it, and they just got totally engaged in nature in general, which I think is so wonderful. Okay, are there any questions?
I don't have a question. I just want to say, apart from the interesting content, your photography was really transporting tonight. Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So so Blanding's turtles are really fascinating, and I think the many aspects to it, given that they are so long-lived and the fact that they mature so late and they have such low fecundity. But that's often been thought of as being why there's so few of them. But I think it's fascinating how down there you keep finding new populations all the time. And at some stage it's going to have to be unlisted because it's so common, right? Which is wonderful, I think. But I know, obviously Tom Herman and Steve Mockford have been working on this. Are there any thoughts on maybe how big the population actually is, or are you just surprised every time that you find a new population?
Based on, I had to, for the last few summers I was working with Blanding's turtles, I had to sit down and look for, on the map, basically, where haven't we looked yet?
Right.
And this new population, I was talking with my old supervisor about it, and she said that was the last area they just couldn't get into. And when they got that sighting report, it was kind of the excuse to go in, and then they found this group. So we kind of all came to the consensus that this is the last one. This is the last group.
Famous last words, maybe.
Yeah. I'd welcome more.
Yes, exactly. No, it's such a fascinating species. I see Peter has a question. Pat, can you unmute there?
Actually, it's Carolyn.
Okay, Carolyn, good.
I was wondering, I actually don't know what they eat, and that would be the question also, what you use for bait in the traps.
So blinding turtles, they have a pretty general diet. I heard they eat quite a few invertebrates, vegetation, fish, if they can catch them. I've seen them eating tadpoles. They seem to love tadpoles. And we bait with sardines because they love the smell of sardines.
Landing turtle, are they just found in the Kejimkujik, McGowan Lake area, or are they in other parts of the province? Are they found anywhere like up in the Pictou area or other places in the province?
As far as we know, blinding turtles are only found on the South Shore in that sort of central area that I mapped out. Wood turtles are sort of more northern shore, up towards Pictou, New Brunswick area, I think. And then snapping turtles and painted turtles are found just about anywhere. There's also a large portion of red-eared sliders in Halifax because people keep releasing them. And there's been a few reports of landing turtles in awkward areas, and we believe that's from people picking them up and thinking that, oh, it's fine if I take it to my house and put it in my pool or pond, and then we get a report of a turtle way up in the middle of nowhere, but it was already marked, so we know where it was from.
Where do they occur outside Nova Scotia?
Oh, where do they occur outside of Nova Scotia? Carter, did you hear that?
Yep.
Yeah,
So
okay.
they actually have quite a large range outside of Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia seems to be that disjunct population that got cut off probably around the last glaciation. So they're in Ontario and I believe some in Quebec, but their largest range is in the States. It's basically all of the northeastern chunk of the States that they are.
Okay, again, then thanks to the three of you. Those were wonderful presentations, really engaging, nice slides, and yeah, just amazing. And I think we started last year having student presentations, and so this is, I believe, the second year. And again, you've kind of blown us away with all the work that you're doing and your enthusiasm and engagement. So wonderful. Thank you. And again, if you could hear everybody, they would be applauding like mad. I can see hands applauding, yes. Very good. Okay, so as you know, Acadia has basically told us that we cannot use the facilities until the fall. So this means that the May and June presentations, we will try to do the same. The May speaker is Glenys Gibson, who will, and I don't know if Glenys is here or not. I don't see her. Anyway, I will do some arm twisting and see if we can get Glenys to talk, because what Glenys was going to do is, if you recall, Sherman Blakeney, yes, he started research out in the mudflats, or that was one of the areas that he did research. And Glenys has, in some sense, taken over what he started. So Glenys, if she agrees to do this online presentation, will talk about her research out on the mudflats and basically show how she's carrying on with some of the work that Sherman Blakeney started. So I think that'll be quite fascinating. Yes, so we'll just see how it goes. Field trips are also going to be difficult this year. And my thought is, and I have started to do kind of a video field trip that I'm putting together. And it'll be looking at, so I'm filming myself walking into the woods and seeing what I see. And as the spring progresses, there'll be more and more stuff growing. And I'm going to see if I can put this together to give you, to post a virtual field trip. Good. So with that, I thank you all. And I think it would be great if you have any questions or any suggestions as to how we might do this differently. And then please send it to me or to anybody on the board. And we will see if we can incorporate some of your suggestions.